All right, I think we are just about ready to begin here. We are live streaming this presentation on YouTube with gratitude to the Orthodox Church in America. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you this evening or this morning, wherever you are around the globe right now. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our keynote presentation of the 2020 Pan-Orthodox Music Symposium. This is our second keynote presentation. We are very lucky to be able to hear this evening from Proto-Presbyter Ivan Moody, who is also the chairman of the International Society of Orthodox Church Music. This conference is being put on in partnership between St. Vladimir Seminary and the Society, and we are so grateful for the opportunity to gather, to hear, and to learn from one another. So my name is Robin Freeman. I'm the Director of Music at St. Vladimir Seminary, and I will be your MC for this evening. We will hear a presentation from Father Ivan, and then there will be time for Q&A afterwards. So for those of you who are symposium registrants, you should be able to enter your questions in the Q&A box via Zoom, and you can enter those at any time, and I will help to moderate the questions at the end of Father Ivan's presentation. Father Ivan will be presenting this evening a keynote presentation, Liturgy as Music. So Proto-Presbyter Ivan Moody studied music and theology at the universities of London, Joensuu, and York, where he took his doctorate. He studied composition with Brian Dennis, Sir John Taverner, and William Brooks, and his music has been performed and broadcast all over the world and commissioned by world-renowned performers. His most substantial works to date are Passion and Resurrection, Akathistos Hymn, and Kohelet. He is also a conductor and a musicologist. As a conductor, he has directed choirs throughout Europe and in North and South America, especially in early and contemporary repertoire. As a musicologist, he has published extensively on the music of the Balkans, of Russia, and of the Iberian Peninsula, with special emphasis on contemporary and sacred music. He has contributed to the Grove Dictionary, Die Musik in Geschichte und Gewart, and Canterbury Dictionary of Hymnology, and the Cambridge Companion to Stravinsky. His book, Modernism and Orthodox Spirituality in Contemporary Music, was published in 2014 and reprinted in 2017. He is a researcher at the Universidade Nova in Lisbon, Portugal. As I've already mentioned, he's the chairman of ISOCM and a proto-presbyter of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, rector of the Orthodox Parish of St. John the Russian in Estoril in Portugal. Father Ivan, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
My very great pleasure. Thank you, Robin. Can you hear me well? Good. Thank you for that unnecessarily elaborate introduction. It's a great pleasure to be joining you in this virtual fashion, and also to have been asked to speak on this topic. So my topic is liturgy as music. I suspect that at the moment I come to read this paper, there will have been a number of discussions concerning exactly what liturgy is and what the word liturgy actually means. This is excellent because it means I don't have to talk about it. Having been requested to reverse the terms of the symposium's title, however, and I must thank David Lux for that suggestion, it is the case that the challenge before me is no less monumental. Can liturgy actually be music? It could be if we expand our terms and look beyond Christianity, but since we're dealing here with a specifically Christian terminology, however ambiguous or capable of sustaining alternative readings, I will limit what I say here to liturgy as understood within the Christian context. I pose the question once again, can liturgy actually be music? And thus another answer. If we allow differences in our definition of liturgy, we must also allow differences in our definition of music. So, in the beginning was the Word. Let me try again. In the beginning was reason. Once more. In the beginning was the Logos. Well, this might not appear to get us very far. If, however, we take a less literal view of what these statements might mean, we might come up with something like this extraordinary passage in chapter 9 of The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, one of his sequence of Narnia books. Quote, "In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away, and Diggory found it hard to decide from what direction it was coming. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. Its lower notes were deep enough to be the voice of the earth herself. There were no words, there was hardly even a tune, but it was, beyond comparison, the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful he could hardly bear it. Then two wonders happened at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead, all at once, was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently, one by one, as on a summer evening. One moment there had been nothing but darkness. Next moment, 1,000 points of light leapt out. If you had seen and heard it, as Diggory did, you would have felt quite certain that it was the first voice, the deep one which had made them appear and made them sing." Unquote. This is the lion, Aslan, singing creation into being. The very first time I read these words, I was awestruck. The creation of the world was being effected by means of music. How, as a musician, as a composer, and as a believer, could I not be astounded? One does not need to remain long in Lewis's parabolic universe in order to understand that he has described in these words a profound truth. The creation of the world by the Logos is obviously something unimaginable to us. So we take the account in Genesis, both at face value and as meaning much more than the words actually say. You may be familiar with a number of modern icons showing Christ bringing the natural world into existence and of Adam naming the animals. This is a visual expression of something we may miss simply by reading the text. In fact, the subject is not iconographically new. Here, if I can share my screen, is one from the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, Sicily, from the 12th century. Now you can see quite clearly there Christ literally energizing Adam, who raises his hands to name the animals. Now, if that icon showing the creative power emanating from Christ and imbuing Adam with life can literally illuminate us as to the reality of what happened at that moment, why should music not also be able to do so? Of course, the problem with music is that it is essentially abstract. So unless we are actually hearing it, we need words to describe it, thereby bringing us back to the same problem of earthbound literalism. But while we're actually hearing music, something else happens, and this is the sense in which it may be liturgy. Here we enter the area, theologically and semantically, of man as the priest of God's creation. While I follow Elizabeth Theocritos' reservations as to possible misunderstandings caused by this use of the term, I note also that she is not resistant to its employment as long as it is properly defined. Insofar as man may be a priest of creation, he is so, for her, insofar as man is a doxological being, in the way that Schmemann intends when he speaks of man as homo adorans. The priestly offering of mankind is, therefore, more than anything else, praise, and specifically within the context of the Eucharist. Theokritos says, quote, "We offer that which becomes part of our own life, not because it cannot be otherwise united with God, but because only thus can we take our place in the liturgy whose celebrant is the Word," unquote. If then the liturgy is celebrated by the Word, and if we are, as the congregation, part of the anaphora, there must be sound. Indeed, this is presupposed very clearly by the insistence in patristic literature on the heavenly correspondence with the earthly celebration of the Eucharist. The apostolic constitutions, for example, from the late 4th century, speak of the seraphim singing with the cherubim, the angels singing in yet another way, and human beings using yet another means of expression. I quote, "And the seraphim with the 6-winged cherubim singing with unceasing voices the triumphal hymn, cry out, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Sabaoth. His brightness fills the whole earth. And the other orders of angels cry, Blessed is the glory of the Lord from his place. While Israel, the church on earth, following the example of the heavenly powers, sings with brave heart and eager mind." End of quotation. Nothing could indicate more clearly that the celebration of the Eucharist is a symphony, angelic and human, and that such a symphony requires active participation with brave heart and eager mind. Then St. Basil the Great, in On the Holy Spirit, points out that the seraphim themselves are taught by the Holy Spirit like a coryphaeus, the coryphaeus originally being the leader of the chorus in ancient Attic drama. And we in turn imitate the celestial liturgy on earth, shouting, singing, and proclaiming the thrice holy hymn. To quote St. Basil, "For life so to abide without the Spirit were as likely as that an army should maintain its discipline in the absence of its commander, or a chorus its harmony without the guidance of the coryphaeus. How could the seraphim cry, Holy, 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 were they not taught by the Spirit how often true religion requires them to lift their voice in this ascription of glory? Do all his angels and all his hosts not praise God?" Unquote. We thus understand that there is nothing arbitrary in these dispositions, emanating as they do directly from the life of the Holy Trinity. This, in turn, corresponds with Dionysius the Areopagite's comprehensive discussion of both the celestial and the earthly hierarchies, structured in order to facilitate intelligible contemplation, for which reason the rites of the Church exist. St. Basil reinforces the point that singers on earth should imitate the singing of the angels, and emphasizes its very concrete results. Quote, "What is more blessed than to imitate the chorus of the angels here on earth, to arise for prayer at the very break of day and honor the Creator with hymns and songs, and then, when the sun shines brightly, to turn to our work, and with prayer as an ever-present companion, to season our tasks with hymns as if with salt. For the consolation of hymns favors the soul with a state of happiness and freedom from care." Unquote. Now, how does such an assertion relate to the abstractness of music? Even though in Lewis's Narnia there are no words at the moment of creation, active participation in the Eucharist by means of music presupposes the addition of text. As the angels' unceasing song of praise indicates. Here I quote from Father Michael Fortunato, who writes that, quote, "The theological character of liturgical chant obviously derives from its intimate association with the sung word, just as the word takes its theological character from the thought that expresses the Orthodox faith. Everything in creation may become a vehicle for theology. Man and the universe are called to be transfigured." And this draws a direct line from sound to word to theology, and is explained by St. John Chrysostom in his exposition on Psalm 41 as follows, quote, "When God saw that most men were slothful, that they came unwillingly to spiritual readings, and that they found the effort involved to be distasteful, wishing to make the labor more grateful and to allay its tedium, he blended melody with prophecy, in order that, delighted by the modulation of the chant, all might raise sacred hymns to him with great eagerness, unquote. Melody blended with prophecy is a phrase that makes one aware of the awesome depth of what is happening when sacred words are intoned. The liturgical singer becomes, in some sense, a prophet. Certainly, he or she is a conduit for prophecy. In other words, the linking of the word of the Old Testament with that of the New, the incarnating, the manifesting here and now of the kingdom. And thus, one may indeed say that music may be liturgy. To quote Father Michael Fortunato once more, he notes that, quote, chant has its existence only in prayer addressed to God in all places of his dominion. In this, it expresses the praise and supplication of the believer, searching for the divine presence. In blessing God, man aspires to holiness and draws near to his Creator. In this sense, the chant that accompanies prayer may be qualified as holy, unquote. And the implication of this statement, together with St. John Chrysostom's observation that men must be delighted by the modulation of the chant, is inevitably that church music, sacred chant, is not only that it is something set apart, ordained for the purpose, but that it must be of the highest quality, the best offering that man can give to his Creator. This is why the Fathers became so frequently engaged in discussions of what music should not be used in liturgical service. The injunctions by Clement of Alexandria and St. Gregory of Nazianzus to Christians to avoid pagan music on account of its low moral character are well-known examples. I should like to step outside the Orthodox framework briefly and into that of the Church undivided by quoting an observation of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI in a discussion of the work of the outstanding theologian Romano Guardini. The then Cardinal Ratzinger writes, quote, Guardini had learned to discover in the Church's human frailty the scandal of God's incarnation. He had learned to see in the Church the presence of the Lord who had made the Church his body. Only when that is accomplished does Jesus Christ synchronize or coexist with us. Without this, there is no real liturgy, which is not a mere recalling of the Paschal mystery, but its true presence. And again, only when this is the case is liturgy a sharing in the Trinitarian dialogue between Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Only in this way is liturgy not our making, but the Opus Dei, God's action upon and with us. Therefore, Guardini emphatically stressed that in liturgy, it was not a matter of doing something, but of being. The idea that general activity is the central value of the liturgy is the most complete antithesis to Guardini's liturgical conception, which one could imagine. The truth is that the general activity of all is not simply not the liturgy's basic value, it is as such no value at all, unquote. Now, I cite this passage because both Guardini and Ratzinger are theologians and liturgical scholars of the highest order, and more particularly because it evokes so well the kairos, the time when the Lord will act, for this is what must be facilitated. This is what Dionysius the Areopagite means by intelligible contemplation. If liturgy is the realization of the kingdom of God on earth, everything must be prepared correctly, with open and humble hearts, so that the kairos may occur. And it must occur intelligibly. The texts we use in liturgy must be theologically correct, and the music to which they are chanted, as Father Michael Fortunato points out, must be holy, no small demand. And such a connection means that we can say both that liturgy can be music and that music can be liturgy. And this should be apprehensible by all. I am struck, for example, by a line in Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet, which refers to, quote, deep voices running like a river over the gravel-bottomed liturgy of St. Basil. This telluric image is striking indeed, as is the fact that an author who was very far from a Christian could write something which so encapsulates, perhaps, the idea of music being liturgy or liturgy being music. Is there perhaps something we could learn from this? This leads me back to C.S. Lewis, but it was, beyond comparison, the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful, he could hardly bear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Ivan. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on this topic. And I want to invite our attendees who are here in the Zoom meeting to go ahead and type any questions that you have for Father Ivan on the content of his presentation into the Q&A box there, and we'll take questions as they come. Looks like we yes. So we have we have one question. Just let's see. It's here we go. So the question, Father Ivan, is here we go. Sorry. How might we as church conductors begin to think about talking to our choirs and our parishes about what quality might be, or how we achieve quality together in our parishes when it comes to music programs?
Oh, I'm glad you didn't start with a difficult question. I'm not sure that it's something you can talk about abstractly. I think, admittedly, this paper was something of an exploration of an idea that I hadn't even really thought about much before. But the more you read what the fathers say, and the more you read what liturgicians such as Father Michael Fortunato have to say about this topic, it's clear that because it's our offering, it has to be as good as we can make it, as I said, more or less. Now, that in a practical sense, that's going to vary according to what kind of music you're singing. I mean, I'm not at all advocating one particular style of church music. So certainly there needs to be thought about how you sing with due attention, with prayerful attention. And that's actually an interesting thing. I'm sure I can't be the only person to have experienced while singing on the Kleros something of a distractedness, because you're concentrated on the musical details and getting things right. But that's part of the singer's duty as well, because you're doing it in the service of the liturgy as a whole. And that is I think, precisely what the Pope Emeritus meant in saying that liturgy is not about doing, it's being. But that being requires us all to do something particular. We all have our functions. I'm sure that didn't answer the question, but
Nobody's complaining yet. So another question that we have from one of our attendees: when you are composing, how does this idea get reflected in your process of creation? The idea of liturgy as music.
That's a very good question. If I'm writing liturgical music, I'm aware of its function and its place precisely in that liturgical scheme, in a way that doesn't matter at all in the same way if I'm writing non-liturgical music. Very often the two things overlap, but that's it's another matter. So if I'm writing genuinely liturgical music, I'm thinking about who has asked me to write it, what their technical capacities are, how I can make it part of the church's tradition, or at the very least, be in some way in dialogue with the church's tradition. A very good example of that is a commission I had a couple of years ago from Peter Yermihov. He asked me to write a polyphonic setting of the liturgy in Greek. And I did so, and almost the entire work is built on chant. He told me what the technical capacities were of his choir, and what challenges could be built into it. And because it was in Greek, I wanted to make it using mostly received tradition Byzantine chant. the kind of thing that's going out of favor somewhat in the United States at the moment, but it's not being done that often in Europe. And it was a wonderful thing to do because it had a particular context. I think I wouldn't write liturgical music, so to speak, on spec, unless I had a desperate need to set a particular text. But I've had the blessing for many years not to be looking for performers. People come to me and want to perform my music, so it tends to work out.
Thank you. Another question that we have: how do you envision the historical and the pastoral intersect within the liturgical music experience?
Very often, history is part of the pastoral aspect. In fact, it always is, in the sense that, and I've written about this on more than one occasion, if you have an established tradition in a parish, the worst thing a new priest can do is come in and change everything. Because even though there may be a need for some change, if you're going to do that, you have to do it very carefully, because the word is pastoral. You're a shepherd of a flock, and you can't throw certain things out just because some people don't like them. And it's not a question of personal taste anyway. There has to be some kind of dynamic at work between the priest and the chanters or the choir and the congregation. And sometimes that's a very difficult thing to achieve, as we all, I think, know. But there needs to be an awareness of that history. I'm thinking actually not just of music, but of churches I've seen in different places in the world where the whole iconographical scheme has been taken out and replaced because it doesn't correspond to somebody's contemporary taste or archaizing taste even. And the same thing can happen with musical repertoires, of course.
Another easy question. Father, can you address what holy means in terms of how the music sounds that is so dictated by culture? How can we view this, what holy means in terms of how music sounds?
That is a very difficult question, and I'm aware that I skirted around it in the paper. Otherwise it would have been 4 times as long. And also one gets into questions of taste. The elephant in the room here is taste, and it's something that we as Orthodox, in discussing the church arts in general, are very wary of talking about. But taste is formed by context. So what sounds or looks holy in one context might not do so in another. For example, if you have, let's say, a Serbian church that was built using what they call the Serbian Baroque style with panel icons, actually quite romantic, even though it's called Baroque, quite romantic in style, and nothing at all to do with Neo-Byzantine style painting. Can you go into that church and say, this art is not holy? Or could you do the same if you go into a Russian church and hear, I don't know, Vasily Titov being sung? Can you say, this art is horrible Baroque rubbish and we should replace it all with Znameny? Right? So this is a continuation in the same way of the same observation I was making before. But it's more fundamental than that, because everyone can have an idea of what sounds more holy. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, now of Cappella Romana's recent work with the captured acoustics of Hagia Sophia. Well, you wouldn't expect to hear music sounding like that anywhere but in a church, and in a very large one. So you could say, in that sense, that music sounds holy. But if we follow Father Michael Fortunato, it's not holy until you actually use it in prayer. So there's a whole set of complex details to be chipped away at here.
Absolutely. Another question about your compositional process. So we have someone who has asked, in your sacred compositions, you sometimes use old church chants, and sometimes you write original compositions. Do you feel any difference working in these two modes?
When I'm writing sacred music, I always try to refer to a chant tradition. So I've used Byzantine chant, Serbian chant, various different kinds of Russian chant and Bulgarian chant. Occasionally, I've set a text with no chant. Usually a short text that there's no reason to quote a chant in it. I'm trying to think of an example. Yes, the Blessed Be the Name of the Lord that I wrote for the Symposium the other year for the visual service. There's no chant in that, but it's such a short piece. I could have found some chant, but I didn't. Nevertheless, it has an ethos, I would say, a musical ethos of chant, because it's informed by my decades of composing. So, and I hope that in some way, working like that has become instinctive. Certainly, when you spend any time working as a composer with chant, it becomes somehow part of you, and your melodic thinking and your harmonic thinking is guided by it.
The questions are pouring in. Here comes another one. How can we view using different types of music as a means of bringing orthodoxy to others? Someone here is referencing the most recent, the setting of Vespers to Black gospel style that happened in the United States earlier this year. So I think could you speak a little bit about how we might be able to use music as a means of bringing orthodoxy or a means of evangelism?
Right. I didn't actually hear that Vespers. I read about it, but didn't manage to hear it. So I don't know how successful it was. My feeling is that if you have performers who are expert in that field, they could probably pull it off. I have preferred to do this in another way, which is by taking Orthodox music into the concert hall, if you like. And so many of my instrumental pieces quote from chant or have a theological reference in some way, which again does not necessarily need to be understood by the listener, precisely because of music's abstractness. It can mean many different things to many different people. But the question, as I understand it, is asking a different thing. I think these things can be done, but you would have to be, as I say, really technically, you'd have to dominate whatever tradition you were trying to adopt really well in technical terms.
That makes a lot of sense. We have several questions that are asking about the place of creativity within liturgical composition. We've had one question specifically about that, and sort of a follow-up asking about, do you think that composing for our Holy Church should always be within a musical tradition or within the system of 8 tones that already exists? So maybe if you could speak a little bit about the role of creativity and inherited tradition.
Yeah. In this context, I think in any context, but it's especially noticeable in what we're talking about, creativity cannot start from nothing. The church has its traditions, and I use the word in the plural advisedly, because they had developed over the course of time. As we all know, they've been tried and tested and have become a part of the church. So if we're going to be creative, we need to take those into consideration. And this was actually my point about writing using chant traditions, because that way I'm engaging with what the church has already given us, and not creating something that has no, not only no place, but no anchor within the traditions of the church. The 8 tones, that's a more complicated question in a way, but it's part of the same thing. If I use a chant melody, which, as I've already said, I do quite a lot, or most of the time, in fact, my harmony will be derived essentially from that melody. So the tone will be actually the guiding principle, even when it's a secular thing. A good example is a piece I wrote for New York Polyphony a few years ago called Vespers Sequence. Every movement is based on, it's not a liturgical composition, but every movement is based on chant. And the chant completely guides the harmony at which I arrive. But you wouldn't listen to it and say, oh, that's obichod tone 8, or this is Byzantine legitos, or something like that, because it's harmonized. And there we have precisely the point of dialogue. And dialogue is, I think, the word here, my creative dialogue with tradition. But it can only work if you are, as a composer, informed by that tradition.
We have a few questions that address the idea of emotion in liturgical composition and performance. Could you speak a little bit about the role of emotion? One of our questions says that some people try to draw emotion in, while others feel that it is not a reliable foundation for Orthodox music.
This is another difficult balancing act we all do, isn't it? I don't think it's appropriate to bring emotion into Orthodox liturgical singing from outside. It's quite enough to have the emotion that's already there. And there are sometimes it's just the text. I mean, I'll give you a very good example. The Gospel of the Denial of St. Peter during Holy Week. I always end up in tears. And I can't. I know it's going to happen, and it doesn't matter what languages I'm reading it in. It always happens. So that's the text. It's not me projecting my own emotion into it, I'm definitely trying not to. In fact, similarly, there are things like the Ex Apostolarion in the first few days of Holy Week, Thy Bridal Chamber, pieces like that. And I don't think this is a matter of musical expression of emotion, because it can happen in in many different chant traditions or harmonized music. So I think that the emotion, I mean, human beings are emotional beings. That's obvious, doesn't even need saying. So as I say, we have to balance this, walk on this tightrope all the time. And for that reason, I'm rather against the idea of trying to bring in emotion. I mean, the reason we read, the reason we intone readings is precisely to avoid speaking in an emotional way. Chant does this too. Well, of course, if you have, let's say, a 19th century, big 19th century Russian setting of a piece, of course it can be emotional in a way that you might say that Byzantine chant, for example, is not. So there's that as well. It depends what the composers put there. So it's not just the emotion that you're injecting as a performer. It's also the way the composer's written the music.
Right, and that comes back to that idea of dialogue that you were talking about earlier. Yeah. This is a great question. What is your best advice for a novice conductor who wishes the music to join with the angels?
Try to be holy. Well, actually, I'm not joking when I say that. it goes back to, I think it was the first question, wasn't it, about how can you encourage people to think about being part of the heavenly liturgy, or to be celebrating with the heavenly liturgy. So that is it really. If we always have in mind the high seriousness of what we're doing when we're singing music in church, that's I think the way to go. And that doesn't mean that there can't be joy in it. It's not a question of that, because the joy will come through anyway. It's just realizing that we're not mucking about here. This is serious stuff. This is the most serious it can be. We're bodying forth the kingdom of God on earth.
Here's a question about, it's offering an analogy and wondering if you would comment on it. When trying to explain the experience of Orthodox liturgy to someone unfamiliar with our worship, we have said that it is like being in an opera. What do you think of that analogy?
It does have some validity. Well, in another context, we were actually discussing the idea of whether you can perform liturgy, and there's a resistance to this word, but the reality is that Orthodox liturgy is dramatic. It's made up of curves and plateaus and processions and actions to which the music corresponds. So in that sense, it is like an opera because it's choreographed. You have different singers doing different things, especially we had an extraordinary paper this morning in another conference. I'm simultaneously in a conference in Thessaloniki, and there was a wonderful paper which showed how the Byzantine conception of the choir, with the different sections of it doing different things, was mirrored in a Russian Old Believers liturgy served by a bishop, and there's a conductor in the middle conducting these enormous groups of people perfectly in tune with a small stick, with a baton, and so that, and they move, because there is movement in the different liturgical things. Some things are intoned from here or there. You're supposed to move for the Katavasi and all those things. So there is that element of choreography and drama and the musical reflection of that in liturgy. But of course, it's not a performance in the way an opera is. But I do think there's an analogy to be made there.
Yes, I wonder who's the stage manager and all and all of that. Then there's a great question here too. Let's see. This is a little bit of a lengthy setup here. So I often tell my choir that our job is twofold, that we must both lead the people in worship as well as create a thing of beauty for God. These two things can sometimes conflict, that the most singable thing by the people is not very beautiful, but the most beautiful settings can be too complicated for people to follow. Can you give advice to conductors who struggle with balancing these two things?
Yeah, that's a very difficult challenge, and obviously not the first story I've heard of that kind, or witnessed, in fact. Sometimes this is just a question of repertoire. When you see a choir struggling to sing 4-part music and they've only really got 2 parts, so you end up with second inversion chords and things on cadences, they're clearly singing the wrong repertoire. But sometimes it takes a lot of convincing people to make those changes. And there is wonderful, if you're in that kind of tradition, there's wonderful 2-part repertoire all over the place these days. Or of course, monophonic chant. Which may or may not end up being harmonized spontaneously or deliberately. That's another matter. But it can be complicated. And I understand this problem. Yeah, I suspect that this happens a lot where you have the congregation very involved in the singing as well, which is not the case in my parish. Anyone who can sing is on the kleros, and all the others. But I know that this does happen in other parishes, and it can be a difficult balancing act. But I think I would be inclined to say it's a question of choosing the right repertoire and getting somewhere nearer to the place you want it to be, because it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be elaborate to be beautiful.
Wow, still so many questions. Everyone wants to know what's on your mind, Father Ivan. Another question from someone who has been, who is a composer and arranger that has at times struggled with trying to set special melodies, and they feel stuck and they feel discouraged. So maybe some advice or encouragement for those who are trying to use special melodies or the traditional, the inherited traditions in terms of chant traditions. How do you get unstuck as a composer? Or
I wonder why special melodies in particular are tricky. But well, again, I think you really have to go back to the melody. I think you need to see what the chant melody. I gave an entire class on a piece of mine that does this actually last year in Prague. We just went through the whole piece and examined each compositional decision they'd taken. It's a harmonization of a Bulgarian chant. And I explained it by saying that every harmonic decision I'd made in the piece was based on what the melody did. Now, it's not the only way to do it. I mean, you could have chosen other notes. And in fact, it was quite interesting. This melody is a kind of E minor. And several of the Greeks wanted to have the bass note as F sharp. So they, whereas most of the Slavs wanted to keep the E minor feel. And there, to explain why you only use a certain chord at one point, to examine where the peaks and troughs of the melody are, what's its direction, what's its melodic flow, and try and build up a harmonic structure on that basis. I think that's what I would do. See what the characteristics of the melody are and go from there.
great. Here's another great, easy question. Can you comment on what you think the new normal will look like for Orthodox singing in parishes due to the pandemic and its aftermath?
I'm very loath to make any predictions about this at all. The reality, I think, is going to be different for every parish. We haven't even gone back into the church yet. We borrow an Anglican church, and there are all sorts of legal questions, and you know, each parish will have its own problems like that to deal with. Yes, it raises the spectre of small, distanced choirs and such like things. And how do we do that liturgically? Can we sing with a visor on? I won't get into the question of communion spoons and all the rest of it. We'll stick to the music. But I can see smaller versions of things working, and that actually may speak to the other question about finding suitable repertoire. Perhaps we won't be able to do all the repertoire we would normally want to do. How would you do it, for example, in the chapel at the seminary? You usually have a big choir there, and you won't be able to.
Right. Right now at the seminary, we have one singer who will do the services. So it does mean thinking creatively about repertoire.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of a longer setup. Here we go. It is easy to reduce music to notes, rhythms, and the like. And of course, Orthodox liturgy is marked by the fact that it is almost entirely sung. But I wonder if there isn't a much higher, broader, deeper meaning of music when considering that not every part of liturgy is literally sung. For example, the homily is a liturgical act. It is liturgy, but it is spoken. Especially as a priest and a musician, how do you think we can apply this thought that liturgy is music to something spoken like a homily?
That's a very interesting question. I would say, I think that, of course, in the past there were sung homilies, But a spoken homily, if we think about the way the ancient world thought about rhetoric, the way that St. John Chrysostom sets up a sermon, just think of the Paschal sermon, for example. He uses words musically in that sense. It's a question of rhetoric. Of course, the theology must be correct, but actually structuring a homily, I say that even though mine are always improvised and never last longer than 5 minutes. Even so, there's a reason for that, and it's to keep concentrating on the gospel reading. If I were a great rhetorician, like St. John Chrysostom, it would be another matter. In fact, I chose him when I became Orthodox back in the prehistory of time. I chose St. John Chrysostom as my saint precisely because I thought I needed help with words rather than music.
All right, I'm mindful of the time. I think maybe we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions here. And here comes one. As the population within a parish changes from an historically ethnic population to one that does not have that background, how do you balance the sensitive topics of language and settings, especially as we try to encourage congregational singing and the desire to work with living composers?
Well, again, the answer is going to vary according to parish. But I would actually, again, go back to my earlier reply about pastoral sensitivity. You can't change everything all at once. I mean, this happens a lot in Greek parishes where you've got a choir of older people who love what they're doing, but they don't do it particularly well, possibly. And then a young priest comes in and wants to change everything to Byzantine chant immediately. It's generally not a good idea because you lose the people who have built up the parish, and you have to find a way to coexist. And I know that's not easy. I know so many car crash stories of these kind of confrontations between priest and psaltis and choir. But there's one example. I would say anything like that would have to be very gradual. I'm talking about music, not language at the moment, but if you want to have new music, it's got to be right for the context. It's got to be performable. There's that word again. It's got to be appropriate for the context and the history of the parish, and not put people off. That's to say, maybe you wouldn't use it all the time. Maybe it would be introduced gradually. There are those kinds of things to consider. Language is a completely different thing in many ways because that really does depend on how the parish works. My own parish is a multi-ethnic, multilingual one, and we often get up to 7 languages. But that's just the way my parish is. Not all parishes are like that, and neither can they be. I wouldn't really presume to give a blanket observation about that. I do think we need to move forward. There needs to be use of music in new languages, in modern languages, certainly. And if you, in fact, look at the fantastic work that John Boyer has been doing in writing new Byzantine chant for English texts, that's a very good example of one way forward. That's if you're in the Byzantine tradition, of course. But other things like that are certainly possible. Or another good example is Nikola Resanovic and his work with Serbian chant.
Right, right. One final question for you after being grilled for a half an hour with lots of very interesting questions. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Really a lot to choose from here. How could we encourage the younger generation within the church to sing in the choir and to pursue vocations as conductors and music teachers in the church?
Well, again, I think that's a context-specific question. If you're a priest, your family is likely to be dragged in and they will become singers, whether they initially want to or not.
Not like we didn't already hear that happen during this symposium.
Um, well, as I said, in my own parish, in fact, the younger people who have become singers or learned how to sing in church have tended to be Russian in origin or Portuguese. I've never had never had a psalty, a proper psalty in my parish. The Greeks who come are lovely people, that they don't sing, um, and so there's that's the way it works out in my parish. In another parish, I think it's very important to encourage children to sing, and to sing on their own, to have parts of the liturgy that they can do by themselves. I know that works in many places, to have a special children's choir, but to put them as well working together with the adult choir. How you make them become conductors? Yes. Well, again, most of us fall into this, don't we? Because a conductor happens to be needed. But there are, I think, if they show aptitude for it and interest in it, then I think it's very good if an Orthodox choir conductor actually does have some conducting lessons. I know that sounds like a stupid thing to say, but so many of us, so many conductors of choirs have never, not even just had a lesson, but actually thought about why they conduct the way they do and how you get the best sound from the choir. Basic technical things. Just looking at other conductors.
Great. Father Ivan, thank you so much for your presentation this evening. And thank you to all of our attendees for submitting such a long list of questions to
Very,
choose
very
from.
good questions.
Yes, yes. Thank you, everybody. And I'm sure we're all giving you a virtual round of applause right now. Father Ivan, can you hear it? Yes, it's happening around the globe right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So a few announcements now for our friends who are joining us through the live stream is that our live streaming for this evening is not done. We have one more event this evening that is being live streamed, and it will be happening via Facebook. Pianist Paul Barnes will be performing a recital for us in about an hour's time. And he will be doing that through the Symposium's Facebook event. It happens at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Paul's presenting a program called Bright Sadness, and it will be a mix of piano works and also some chant. So we're really looking forward to hearing Paul's recital and enjoying some music together that way. So we hope you will be able to join us. A few more announcements for those of you who are participating in the symposium, just some little housekeeping items that we have. Please remember, if you would like to submit a selfie headshot for our virtual group photo. Since we can't all be together to take a big one, we're going to be using your selfies in order to build out a picture of what we all look like together as a gathering this year. A survey will be sent out to all of our participants on Saturday, tomorrow, at the conclusion of the symposium for your feedback and your input on this experience and what you are taking away from being with us. This evening, after Paul's performance, there will be a special symposium participant reception with Paul and with several of the composers who are also on the program. It'll allow you to hear a little bit more about the pieces and allow you to ask some questions of Paul and the composers. And that's happening at 7 p.m. via the Zoom link on our Symposium Chorus Connection site. Since everyone is invited to join on that, and please, if you'd like, you can bring your favorite beverage so that we can toast Paul at the end of the recital. It is after 5 p.m. where we are at that point of time and the weekend. Please join us at that point in time if you can this evening. Please watch for recordings of the master classes, the presentations, and the workshops to appear on Chorus Connection. Feel free to watch and re-watch them as needed there. And finally, tomorrow morning, just a reminder that there are 3 things that are kicking off our day tomorrow. One is a workshop with Juliana Woodill on sight singing for the church musician. That we also have a workshop with Father Sergius Halverson on achieving quality reading and chanting in the services. And if you feel like joining other people to have some informal chatting about various topics in Orthodox music, we have some virtual coffee chats that are going to be hosted by 5 different attendees of the symposium. Please let me know if you have any questions about those. You can email me or you can email David Lux, my co-host for this symposium. Thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you all later at Paul's recital and at the reception afterwards.